When the Crusader armies finally turned their backs to the battlegrounds of the eastern Mediterranean and began their long journey home, the world they left behind did not simply fall silent. It shifted, recalibrated, and closed its doors around those who had no armies to defend them. Across Europe, in towns reshaped by years of absence, women found themselves confronting systems that had grown harsher in the vacuum of returning soldiers. The moment the Crusaders marched in triumph, these women faced a new reality, one built not on liberation, but on scrutiny, suspicion, and constraints that tightened the moment their protectors reappeared. The late 11th through the 13th centuries formed an age of rigid hierarchies, religious certainties, and unforgiving institutions.
Christian kingdoms spoke of holy purpose, of victory, of sacrifice. Yet behind this language stood communities fractured by separation, poor harvests, shifting loyalties, and the fear of who had remained loyal while the men marched east. For women, especially those whose husbands, brothers, or guardians went to war, the return of these armies did not restore order, it introduced a new wave of judgment. Their conduct, their alliances, their choices during those years of waiting were placed under a microscope by families and church authorities who believed absence demanded absolute obedience. This is the world into which we step, one where widows, abandoned spouses, and women without protection faced forms of pressure that rarely made it into official chronicles.
Their fate was shaped by whispered accusations, financial traps, moral expectations, and laws designed not to safeguard them, but to maintain property, lineage, and control. And while the chronicles recorded the triumphs of kings and knights, they left almost nothing about the quiet suffering of thousands of women who endured conditions no one should face, simply because war had changed their households forever. In uncovering these shadows, we preserve stories history rarely recorded. It is this mission that has always defined dark inquest history, where overlooked voices are allowed to speak again through the remnants they left behind. This video explores the dark fate of women left behind after Crusader armies returned home.
To understand their situation, we must first examine the world that shaped them. Europe in the age of the Crusades operated on a fragile web of land ownership, vows of loyalty, and religious authority. When men departed for campaigns, they often mortgaged their estates, pledged their households to church oversight, or left local lords to act as guardians in their absence. These agreements were rarely simple. Many were designed to protect property, not people. Women were expected to maintain households, manage laborers, oversee production, and safeguard assets, all while navigating the silent expectations of faithfulness and unwavering obedience. When the armies returned, these women were judged not by their success in survival, but by how closely they had held to the roles the institutions had prescribed for them.
The more responsibility a woman had taken on during her husband's absence, the more threatening she appeared to social order the moment he returned. Some had run estates more efficiently than their absent lords. Others had negotiated alliances, settled conflicts, or managed finances in ways that preserved their communities. Yet these accomplishments were rarely celebrated. Instead, they were examined as deviations from the expected norms of submission. The first wave of pressure came through the church courts. Priests kept careful watch over households left behind, and upon the men's return, any whisper of improper alliances or independence was treated as grounds for severe accusations. Even unproven rumors could lead to investigations, interrogations, and lifelong stigma.
The women's personal accounts seldom survived, but financial records, penance registers, and property disputes reveal a pattern. Returning men often viewed their wives and female relatives not as partners who had sustained their livelihoods during years of uncertainty, but as individuals whose behavior required justification. The second wave of tension emerged from economic upheaval. Crusading expeditions were expensive. Many returning knights were burdened by debts that had accumulated during their absence. These debts were often repaid by seizing property, rearranging inheritances, or dissolving agreements that women had negotiated for survival. A widow who had maintained a stable estate found herself suddenly stripped of authority in favor of distant male relatives.
A married woman who had taken essential control over farmland or trade routes was ordered to step back, regardless of her capability or the needs of the community. Some women were coerced into marriages arranged quickly to secure property. Others were pressured into vows that returned control of their households to the church. Many endured forms of harsh punishment for decisions made under duress when war had left them alone. These consequences were rarely recorded in detail, yet the sudden disappearance of names in community records, the transfer of estates with minimal explanation, and the abrupt emergence of guardianships reveal a quiet landscape of institutional force. The third wave came from returning soldiers themselves, men shaped by years of conflict, unfamiliar hierarchies, and distance from domestic life.
Their expectations of behavior had been molded by religious rhetoric that portrayed women as symbols of purity and duty. Any deviation from these idealized images was interpreted not as a response to circumstance, but as moral failure. In households where men returned physically or psychologically changed, the burden of adjustment fell disproportionately on the women who had kept those households functioning. Many faced severe mistreatment rooted not in personal wrongdoing, but in the unresolved tensions between wartime absence and peacetime authority. Yet the structure of oppression extended beyond individual families. Entire communities were rebuilt around the belief that returning warriors had earned unquestioned dominance.
This belief shaped local laws, inheritance customs, and social judgments. Women who had displayed resilience during the years of the Crusades found that resilience reframed as defiance. Their agency was seen not as heroic, but as suspicious. Their survival choices were treated as potential betrayals. Their independence was viewed as a threat to the patriarchal order the returning soldiers insisted on restoring. Town councils enforced restrictions on women's movements. Church officials demanded public penance for rumors often impossible to disprove. Families pressured daughters and widows into relinquishing land or complying with marriages arranged solely to resolve financial burdens. None of these actions were framed as cruelty within their own time. They were justified as reinstating the order that war had disrupted.
In many regions, women left behind by men who never returned suffered even harsher outcomes. Crusaders who died abroad often left no clear record of their estates, no instructions for their families, and no protection for the dependents they abandoned. Widows in such cases were treated not with sympathy, but with suspicion. Without a male relative's testimony, their rights to property were challenged, their reputations questioned, and their ability to support themselves constrained by institutional apathy. Local lords frequently absorbed the land of these unprotected households, citing ambiguous documentation or spiritual debts owed by the deceased. The psychological toll was profound. Communities that had relied on women's leadership during wartime abruptly redefined them as liabilities. Many were forced into silence, choosing compliance over resistance, because resistance often resulted in consequences worse than the injustices themselves. The social expectation was not for women to reclaim a life disrupted by war, but to blend back into an order that never acknowledged their contributions. In examining these patterns, we see not isolated tragedies, but a system operating with cold efficiency. It was a structure built to preserve lineage, property, and power, not to honor the labor or endurance of those who kept society functioning in the absence of its armies. As we continue deeper, we will trace how this system escalated, how institutions tightened control, and how countless women disappeared from historical sight, not through dramatic events, but through administrative decisions, silent coercion, and the weight of expectations they could not break.
As the Crusades stretched across generations, the pressures placed upon women left behind deepened in complexity and severity. What began as temporary adjustments evolved into permanent structures of oversight, creating a cycle that repeated with every new wave of military departure and return. Institutions learned how absence reshaped communities, and they adapted with mechanisms that ensured control never loosened, no matter how long men remained abroad. women found themselves navigating a world that expected unwavering loyalty during separation and unquestioned submission upon reunion. It was a paradox woven into every aspect of their lives, reinforced by custom, law, and the expectations of faith.
The Church was the first pillar reinforcing this paradox. During the Crusades, clergy not only served spiritual functions, but also acted as custodians of property, guardians of family reputations, and interpreters of moral conduct. Their authority expanded as men entrusted them with oversight of households. In many regions, this oversight became so embedded that even after the troops returned, the Church continued to monitor women's behavior, believing the moral risks of wartime autonomy had not fully passed. The very institutions that had promised protection frequently became instruments of judgment, reminding women that their place in society remained conditional on compliance. Church records reveal subtle but telling patterns. A sudden rise in penance demands, a spike in disputes involving inheritance rights, cases where women were pressured to confess to misdeeds they never committed, simply because refusing such pressure was viewed as defiance. The descriptions in these records are restrained, yet behind their formal language lies a clear message. Women were expected to justify their integrity in ways men never were. Even unverified rumors gained the weight of truth when they aligned with existing anxieties about female independence. Local lords formed the second pillar. Their responsibilities increased dramatically during each crusading expedition, as countless estates were placed under their temporary control.
While these arrangements were supposed to be provisional, many lords grew accustomed to the power and resources they gained. When soldiers returned, the transition back to pre-war governance became uneven and often contentious. Lords who had managed estates during the absence of crusaders frequently resisted relinquishing authority, and the women who had maintained household operations found themselves caught in the middle of power struggles they had no voice in. Some lords accused women of mismanagement to justify continued oversight. Others exploited ambiguous contracts made before the Crusades to seize land outright. Even when returning men contested these actions, the legal processes dragged on for years, leaving women with no stable ground in the meantime.
Their livelihoods depended on decisions made by men who viewed them primarily as extensions of property holdings, not as individuals with their own rights or experiences. In many cases, the pressure was so overwhelming that women accepted arrangements that offered them less autonomy simply to avoid prolonged conflict. The third pillar was the returning warriors themselves, whose expectations had been shaped by a mixture of religious fervor, military hierarchy, and prolonged distance from domestic life. The Crusades had reinforced rigid notions of family honor and purity, and when these men came home, many carried an idealized image of how their households should have remained during their absence.
Any deviation, whether real, imagined, or invented by community rumor, could be interpreted as a threat to masculine authority. As a result, women often faced suspicion not because of anything they had done, but because the mere fact of survival required decisions that men had not anticipated. Even faithful stewardship could be reframed as impropriety. A woman hiring laborers to tend the fields might be accused of overstepping traditional boundaries. A widow negotiating trade to keep her home functioning might be viewed as taking too much initiative. A wife seeking assistance from neighbors could be portrayed as forming alliances beyond her station. These interpretations were not formal verdicts, they were judgments embedded in community conversation, capable of shaping reputations for years.
Psychological pressure became an unspoken reality of the post-Crusade era. Men returned expecting stability, yet the world had changed in their absence. Their own experiences often left them grappling with the dissonance between wartime discipline and the quieter demands of home life. Many imposed strict rules within their households, attempting to restore an imagined past that had never truly existed. Women, who had carried the burdens of survival, found themselves forced into silence as a means of maintaining fragile peace. Domestic expectations became heavier, not lighter, in the aftermath of war. Yet the harshest realities belonged to those whose husbands did not return. widows of Crusaders occupied a precarious position.
Their livelihoods depended on documents that often failed to survive the chaos of distant campaigns. Without clear proof of marital arrangements or property rights, widows risked losing everything to guardianships imposed by the church or local nobility. The law portrayed these measures as protective, but in practice, they stripped women of autonomy, placing them under the authority of men who benefited from controlling their land and resources. In many communities, widows were pressured to remarry quickly, not for companionship, but to resolve disputes over inheritance. Marriage became a tool for redistributing property rather than honoring personal choice. Those who resisted faced increasing isolation.
Gossip portrayed unmarried widows as unstable influences on the community. Councils restricted their rights to conduct business. Some faced accusations of moral failing simply because they remained independent longer than local leaders found acceptable. This atmosphere of scrutiny and coercion created a cycle in which women's lives were reshaped at every stage by external forces. Their contributions during the Crusades were remembered only when convenient. Their independence was tolerated only until it disrupted the interests of men who returned seeking control. Their voices rarely appeared in chronicles, not because they had nothing to say, but because the institutions that produced written records did not deem their experiences worthy of preservation.
The absence of testimonies is one of the most haunting aspects of this period. While we have letters from knights, accounts from clergy, and chronicles written by scholars, the perspectives of women are largely absent. Their stories survive only in fragments: property transfers, legal disputes, dowry records, and occasional mentions in court proceedings. These documents reveal enough to understand the pressures they faced, yet they remain incomplete, shadows of lives shaped by forces beyond their choosing. Examining these fragments reveal patterns that speak to broader societal structures. For example, documents show that many women were removed from estates they had managed successfully during wartime.
The official reason was often financial inconsistency, but the real motivation was restoring property to male control. Other records show sudden transfers of guardianship over wealthy widows, justified by claims of protection, despite no evidence of actual danger. In some regions, widows were relocated to religious institutions under the claim that spiritual guidance was necessary, even when they had expressed a desire to remain in their homes. In the towns surrounding major Crusader recruitment centers, a cultural anxiety developed concerning loyalty. Communities questioned whether women had remained aligned with church teachings during years of uncertainty. This suspicion manifested in laws regulating dress, movement, and public presence.
Restrictions were placed on gatherings. Women were encouraged, or required, to attend specific church services, emphasizing obedience and moral duty. These measures acted less as guidance and more as precaution, reinforcing a belief that women needed constant oversight to maintain social order. Another layer of pressure emerged from economic change. The return of Crusader armies often disrupted local markets. Prices shifted, trade routes changed. Soldiers returned with expectations of wealth that rarely matched reality. These economic tensions influenced household dynamics in subtle yet damaging ways. Women who had maintained steady financial management during wartime suddenly found their budgets overridden by men eager to assert authority.
Individuals burdened by crusade debts sometimes directed frustration at their families, particularly at wives tasked with stretching limited resources into sustainability. The emotional weight of these circumstances left many women managing not just households, but also the unpredictable temperaments of men grappling with their own disappointments. Communities, too, played a significant role in shaping the fate of women after the Crusaders returned. Neighbors who once supported their efforts during wartime sometimes became arbiters of judgment afterward. Rumors formed quickly, often based on nothing more than personal grievances or shifting alliances. These rumors could influence church investigations, determine court decisions, and decide whether a woman retained her home or lost everything to the claims of distant relatives.
Reputation became a currency more fragile than land, and many women found themselves navigating an environment where silence offered the only measure of safety. In certain regions, particularly in France and the Holy Roman Empire, local councils adopted rules explicitly addressing the status of women whose husbands remained abroad for extended periods. These rules outlined acceptable behaviors, but left wide room for interpretation. Community leaders could label almost any action as inappropriate if they believed it threatened social order. Women who managed farms, negotiated contracts, or handled business affairs risked being seen as stepping beyond their sanctioned roles. These accusations did not need evidence, they needed only consensus among men seeking to consolidate authority.
Women of lower status faced especially harsh conditions. Without wealth or influential relatives, they lacked the mechanisms to defend themselves from coercion. Laborers, servants, and those living in rural outskirts endured restrictions that left them vulnerable to exploitation. Their hardships rarely appeared in written records, but the absence of documentation itself speaks to the systemic disregard for their well-being. They were expected to endure, to comply, and to remain invisible to the very institutions that governed their lives. Across Europe, the emotional landscape of post-Crusade society was dominated by uncertainty. Families struggled to reconcile the world they had adapted to with the world that returned home.
But for women, the consequences were far more severe. The expectations placed upon them were contradictory. They were to remain entirely loyal, yet entirely passive, entirely responsible, yet entirely subordinate. Any misstep, whether real or perceived, could lead to suffering behind closed doors or the quiet erosion of their rights. The tragedies of this period were rarely sudden. They unfolded slowly, through decisions made in council chambers, in church offices, at household tables, and in whispered conversations that shaped local opinion. Women's identities were rewritten not by dramatic events, but by a cumulative force of rules, judgments, and unspoken expectations. Their erasure from historical memory was not an accident. It was the result of systems designed to document the lives of men while leaving women in the margins.
Yet, despite these pressures, many women continued to display resilience. They adapted, negotiated, compromised, and endured. Some forged alliances to protect their homes. Others managed to maintain influence within their communities through quiet diplomacy. A few left traces of their voices through rare letters or legal testimonies. But these fragments remind us of a larger truth, that the overwhelming majority faced struggles that went undocumented, overshadowed by the grand narratives of crusading glory. As we move toward the deeper layers of this investigation, we will explore how these forces converged into a final wave of systemic control, one that sealed the fate of many women and ensured their stories were either distorted or lost entirely.
The final wave of pressure that swept across Europe after the Crusader armies returned was neither sudden nor loud. It unfolded through a sequence of administrative decisions, shifting expectations, and the quiet determination of institutions to restore a version of order that had existed only in memory. Women who had endured years of instability were now confronted with a different kind of uncertainty, one rooted not in absence, but in the reassertion of authority. Every relationship, every financial arrangement, every social expectation was renegotiated through a lens shaped by war, faith, and the desire of returning men to reclaim their place in a world that had moved on without them. In many communities, the first sign of this shift came through formal inquiries.
Councils assembled to evaluate disputes that had accumulated in the years of absence. These inquiries were framed as routine governance, yet they often centered on the conduct of women who had managed estates or made decisions essential for survival. Officials asked whether agreements made during wartime should remain valid. They reviewed permissions women had received to conduct business, questioning whether those permissions should now be revoked. These inquiries rarely acknowledged the necessity of women's wartime responsibilities. Instead, they interpreted their actions as exceptions that needed correction. The Church played a decisive role in these proceedings. Clergy who had overseen households during the Crusades frequently recommended stricter oversight after the armies returned.
Their rationale rested on the belief that women who had operated with even limited authority might struggle to step back into the roles the institution deemed appropriate. They warned of moral risk, of potential disorder, and of household instability, using these phrases to justify new restrictions. These recommendations were not framed as punishment, but as guardianship, yet their effect was to limit freedoms women had exercised responsibly for years. Returning men found these institutional attitudes reinforcing their personal expectations. Many had carried with them an idealized vision of the homes they left behind, shaped by sermons that emphasized obedience and by military discipline that left little room for emotional nuance.
When confronted with the practical adjustments their families had made to survive, some perceived these changes not as necessary adaptation, but as challenges to their authority. Women who had solved crises, negotiated contracts, or protected resources were now expected to relinquish control without hesitation. The disconnect between years of silent endurance and sudden expectations of passivity created a tension that households struggled to contain. This tension was not limited to individual families. It rippled through villages and towns, influencing community norms. Leaders enacted measures to discourage what they called disruptive independence. These measures took many forms: rules limiting public gatherings, restrictions on women conducting business without male witnesses, and requirements that property transfers receive approval from church officials.
Each rule was justified as a means of ensuring stability, yet collectively they reshaped daily life in ways that narrowed women's possibilities and reinforced rigid hierarchies. Economic pressures deepened these restrictions. The debt accumulated by crusading expeditions often forced men to make immediate financial decisions upon returning home. Estates needed restructuring, loans needed repayment, and land needed reorganization. In this environment, women's priorities, maintaining community ties, preserving local agreements, protecting long-term stability, were sometimes dismissed as secondary to the urgent financial concerns of returning soldiers. Decisions that once balanced survival and cooperation now tilted towards consolidation and recovery, frequently at the expense of the women who had sustained those households through years of uncertainty.
Widows faced the most precarious situation of all. Without the voice of a returning husband to validate their decisions, they were vulnerable to challenges from distant relatives, local lords, or church authorities. Their property could be reassigned, their marriages arranged, or their autonomy curtailed based on interpretations of documents they had no power to contest. Some were relocated to religious institutions under the argument that spiritual guidance would protect them. Others were placed under guardianship arrangements that reduced their independence to a fraction of what they had exercised during wartime. Their identities were reshaped not through personal choice, but through the administrative needs of the institutions that surrounded them.
Even women whose husbands returned safely were not free from scrutiny. Communities viewed them through the lens of expectation. A woman who had maintained strong control over her household might be judged as too assertive. A woman who had relied on neighbors might be suspected of forming bonds considered inappropriate. A woman who had struggled financially might be accused of mismanaging resources. These judgments rarely reflected the reality of wartime pressures. Instead, they mirrored the anxieties of a society attempting to reconcile the past with the present. Women bore the weight of these anxieties in ways that left little room for recognition of their efforts. As these pressures mounted, a new narrative emerged in community memory, one that quietly replaced the reality of women's wartime resilience with stories of vulnerability and instability.
Chroniclers emphasized the dangers women faced, but often framed those dangers as moral rather than structural. Instead of acknowledging economic hardships or institutional neglect, they spoke of temptation, uncertainty, and the need for guidance. This narrative placed responsibility for wartime challenges not on the systems that had failed to support women, but on the women themselves, reinforcing the belief that strict oversight was necessary. The culmination of these forces produced a moment of profound silence. Many women withdrew from public life, not out of preference but out of necessity. Their experiences of waiting, working, negotiating, enduring were rarely shared openly because sharing them risked judgment.
Their contributions were absorbed into the background of community survival, unrecorded and unrecognized. Their names disappeared from documents once they were replaced by male authority figures, leaving only traces in ledgers or property lists. The absence of their stories was not accidental. It was the product of a structure that valued stability over truth, order over individual experience. Yet even in this silence, the impact of their efforts remained. Communities survived the Crusades not because of returning armies, but because of the people who maintained the foundations of daily life during years of uncertainty. Fields were tended, debts negotiated, homes preserved, disputes resolved, all through the labor of women whose names rarely appeared in historical accounts.
Their resilience created the conditions that allowed returning soldiers to rebuild their lives, even if that resilience went unacknowledged. The darkest aspect of their fate lies not in the pressures they endured, but in the erasure that followed. Their struggles did not end with the return of the Crusader armies. Instead, they were buried beneath narratives that celebrated the triumphs of men, while overlooking the quiet strength that sustained entire societies. Their absence from the record is a reminder that suffering behind closed doors leaves fewer traces than victories recorded on parchment. Their legacy exists in the spaces between official accounts, in the gaps, the inconsistencies, the unexplained transfers of property, the sudden disappearances from community records.
In the end, the women left behind after the Crusades did not vanish because they were unimportant. They vanished because the institutions of their time defined importance in ways that excluded them. Their lives were shaped by systems that valued control over understanding, authority over compassion, and lineage over lived experience. The world they preserved did not preserve them in return. And yet, their endurance forms a crucial part of history. Without their labor, their negotiation, their quiet strength, the European world that emerged after the Crusades would not have existed. Their contributions may not have been celebrated, but they were essential. Their silence does not signal insignificance. It signals the weight of a burden carried without support, recognition, or lasting acknowledgement.
To remember them is to recognize the cost of systems that elevate triumph while concealing the suffering endured in its shadows. It is to acknowledge that history is not only shaped by those who lead armies, but also by those who preserve life in their absence. And it is to honor the resilience of individuals whose stories were never written, yet whose impact shaped generations. Their fate warns us that absence in the record does not mean absence in history. It means only that someone chose not to record what they endured. By looking beyond the official accounts, by reading between the lines, we restore a measure of dignity to those who carried the weight of survival without the protection of recognition. To honor the forgotten voices who lived through institutional pressure and systemic injustice in the aftermath of the Crusades, remember that preserving their stories is an act of restoring balance to a world that once overlooked them. Subscribe to Dark Inquest History,